Okay. You guys are aware it's my last week?
No.
So this is your chance to learn some JavaScript from me before I go. But anyways, I think fundamentals are really, really important before like jumping into the DOM because it would help you become better JavaScript masters and avoid mistakes that could happen. So this is pretty unplanned, but these are some of the topics that I'm hoping that we can cover together today before 1:30, hopefully. So really want to focus in on functions in particular, how to translate a function into an ES6 function, callback functions using things like map, filter, stuff like that. Also like cover the concept of hoisting, which has to do with functions. And just go over iterators, go over let, const, var, go over scoping due to Graham's suggestion. And then if we have time, point by value versus point by reference, which is another like tricky JavaScript concept. We should also cover falsy data types. Maybe we can do that first as well, just because they're super different from Ruby. But make sure you take notes because a lot of this, you will mess this up. Like someday you will mess this up and then you're gonna be like, Jane told me that I would mess this up. So please make sure you pay attention. So that said, let's make our index.html file so we can play with stuff. But we're not gonna be really doing a lot of DOM stuff. Do you guys know the shortcut for making a very simple HTML file? You can do HTML tab. Yeah, so let's just put something really simple in here. Jane's last lecture. Maybe? All right. Let's not be so sad. And so if we open this, wait, this is my old thing. I'm sorry I have too many tabs. Let's try it here. Yeah, I didn't take the full path. This is what happens when you have too many tabs. Okay. All right, so now let's connect the JavaScript file, kind of what we've been doing. So let's touch index.js. And we can put something like a console log hello. So this should appear, right? So how do we connect our JavaScript file? And there's 3 different ways to do it. Sylvia? Yeah. In the head. So usually the last thing in the head would be a good place. So what do I call it? All right, cool. So there's a lot going on here. Really all you need is index.js. You don't really need to include the other stuff, right? Let's see if it works. So now we're getting hello, right? What's the issue with putting things in the head? Matt? Yeah, so because it reads top down, and this is like an important thing to review, your JavaScript or your HTML file is read top down, so then if you're here, you're not going to have access to any of this stuff here. Does anyone know the solution around that, which would allow you to stay in the head? Arnie?
In your JavaScript file, you document content. Do you want content loaded events?
That is one way to do it. So let's actually test that we can grab this element. And I promise this is the only DOM stuff that we're going to do today, just because I do want to get to some of the fundamentals. How would I grab that H1 element? Yumi?
There's multiple ways, but you can do query selector or like
Okay, so what's the syntax for that?
Document chapter.
And then?
And then you go to the body and then the hashtag.
You could, but we also could just give the element if we wanted to, so we could just do h1 and it finds it, right? So if we actually try to console log this thing, we set our element to this and we try to console log it. And do you guys know about labeling arguments? This is another one of those very useful tips and tricks in JavaScript. Did you know that your console log can take more than one argument? Yeah, so your console log can have more than one argument. So if you had multiple variables, you can put them separated by commas. But really, really good practice, especially when you get into React, is to have your first argument be a string that tells you what you're console logging, and your second argument be that variable. So I can be like h1 element. And see how here it's null because we didn't load the document properly. So someone had a suggestion for how to fix this. Who had a suggestion? Was it you, Ernie? Okay. So tell me more.
Okay, we're going to go to our JavaScript file and we're going to create an event.
Mm-hmm.
So we have documents. Document add event listener.
Mm-hmm.
Parentheses. Quotation DOM content loaded.
Yep.
Okay.
And then?
I'm not sure actually.
All right, so
Oh, okay, we need our callback function.
we need our callback function. Are you guys okay with arrow functions? We're gonna go over arrow functions as well. But this would be the arrow function way of doing it, and we're gonna go more into the details of like how to actually translate something from a regular function to an arrow function. But it's pretty similar to just writing function, right? So if we move this up, should we see this console log now? Ah, we have our element. So this is the first way that you can connect your JavaScript file correctly so that it actually has access to all of the elements in your body. By using an event listener for DOM content loaded, which makes sure that everything is loaded onto the DOM before using it. What's another solution? If we weren't to use DOM content loaded and we wanted this to work, which it doesn't, what's another solution? Lizelle? Yes! How did you know? I didn't give you this lecture last time. Yeah. So you can also just type the word defer, and I'll also wait until everything is loaded, instead of using DOM content loaded, if you wanted to keep your script tag in the head. So now, we also have access to our element. So that is the second way of connecting your JavaScript file correctly to your HTML file. Ernie?
Are there disadvantages to defer? Because it seems better.
There are no disadvantages.
Okay.
It's really up to you as a developer to decide how you want to do it. And what about the third way? Brendan? Mm-hmm. Where exactly?
Below the body, before the HTML closes head, right in the body.
So here? Will this work? It works. The way I learned it is still have it in the body, but as the very last thing, right? So you can also do it this way. And all of these ways work because it just goes top down, right? So now we've successfully connected our file. Let's go on to some JavaScript fundamentals. Yay! All right, so let's start with functions. Ay, ay, ay. I really want to make sure that you guys understand all of like the complexities revolving around functions. So let's start really, really simple. If I just wanted to write a basic function that takes in two numbers and adds them together, what would be the syntax for writing that?
Function, parentheses, num1 plus num2, I suppose, any that you want to call them. Alright, and then num1 plus num2. So do we want this logged or do we want it returned?
We want it returned.
Okay, then return num1.
Let's stay away from console logging things. We actually really do want to use functions in order to return something. There's really two types of ways that you use functions, now that I think about it. One is you do want to return something. It's like when you're making a pie. You have a recipe. Your function is like a recipe. And in the end, you get a pie out of it. So then when you invoke your function, you can assume that once you invoke it, you'll actually have the thing that you want. So that's one way to use a function. Another way to use a function is like cleaning your house. So for instance, you can have a function that has a bunch of things you want to do. You want to put this on the DOM, you want to put that on the DOM, you want to remove that thing. And at the end, it doesn't really return anything. But once you've done all those tasks, it's like you have a clean house. So a lot of times working with the DOM, you don't necessarily need to return things. But if you're using a function where once you invoke it, you want to store that value and use it for something else, that's when you actually want to have a return keyword. So how would we invoke this function? Mallory? Do we have to give it a name? Okay, sorry, I'm just messing with you guys now. You can do this actually in JavaScript.
But then how would we call it later?
You can't call it later.
Okay,
That's
sorry,
the thing. But yeah, you can give it a name. So what should we call it? Sum? I heard sum. All right, cool. So now we can call our function, pass in some numbers, right? Let's see if it works. Console logging the result of this. And it's working. So this is one way to write a function. What's a different way to write this function? We could do it as an arrow function, but before we get to arrow functions, how do we do this as like saving it into a variable? So this way of making a function is called a function declaration. What's a way to do this where we save our function into a variable? Brendan?
Do you mean like, say like const functions equals
Yes.
num1, num2, arrow function? Oh, arrow.
Like this?
No.
So let's not talk about arrow functions yet, because I want to make sure you guys understand the difference between function declaration and then this way, which is called function expression. And then we'll talk about how to think about converting a regular old ES5 function into a ES6 arrow notation. Because this right here is not like making a function expression doesn't necessarily have to be an arrow function. So don't think of it like this has to be an arrow function. So how would we write this syntax?
Still in the same way. It's still be the same function, num1, num2.
Exactly. So it's still the same thing, basically. Pass in your arguments, have a return value. The only difference is that your name is actually in the beginning. But it should work the same way, so let's test it out. And this way of writing a function is called a function expression. What do you guys think? All right, let me ask you this. Do you think this will work? Who says yes, this will work? Who says no, this will break? I want to hear reasoning from both sides.
Well, you're declaring the function below the console log.
Okay, so,
It might not have the sum loaded.
okay. And for someone who says it will work? Yes, Emmanuel?
I believe it'll, so JavaScript it'll compile the function, but when it executes, it'll hoist it. So essentially it'll still run console log.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Ernie?
I believe it will work because from what I understand, JavaScript reads the file twice. First, it goes through the file to set up to find all the variables that are declared. Then on the second run, then it does its computations.
Okay, let's test it. So it breaks.
I broke.
Cannot access sum before initialization. So our file is read in order, right? So we're trying to use a function before it's declared here. What about I keep forgetting the shortcut. What do you think this will do? Do you think it'll have the same behavior or different behavior? Again, I'm invoking a function before it's called. Brendan?
It should.
This one should run? Why would this one run when the last one didn't run?
The last one was a variable. You had a const sum. You can still access functions, call functions in different parts of the JavaScript program. If I remember correctly. I could be wrong. I think.
Okay, any other thoughts? Let's test it. So this way works. So, Matt?
I was just wondering, because what Ernie said made me really curious. Is that sort of true? Does it declare functions on the first read through?
Yeah, so that's what we're going to talk about next. This is the whole idea of hoisting. So your JavaScript code, as Emmanuel was saying, there's like multiple passes in your program. And the first time that you run through the code, it declares variables, but it doesn't define them. So, for example, if I had a variable, var banana, and I set it equal to banana is a fruit, and I tried to console log banana, this should work, right? We console log banana as a fruit. If I tried to do this before it's defined, what do you think we're going to see? Brendan? Exactly. So we're seeing undefined. It actually knows that this banana variable exists, but it's not defined yet. So on the first pass of your code, it's almost as if this is happening. So it's declaring the variable, but it's not defining it. On the second pass of your code, it's actually executing the code. So if you hit a console log, it's going to be undefined here. And so that's kind of the same thing that's happening here, right? So if we're trying to call the function, and we give it two numbers, it's almost as if our code it's running through once, it's finding the variable sum, but it's setting it to undefined. Then it's trying to use it, but it's still undefined. And then later in our code, it's defined. That's what this way, as a function expression, when it's a variable. But things work a little bit differently when you're using a function declaration like this. So a function declaration consists of not setting your function to a variable, but using the function keyword beforehand. And the passes through your program work a little bit differently. So as it's reading your code line by line, It's taking variables, it's declaring them but setting them to undefined. But every time it sees a function keyword, it does this thing called hoisting, where it basically hoists it to the top of your program. So no matter where you are in your code, you could be trying to call this function before you've defined it. It'll still work because the function keyword with the function declaration actually hoists it to the top so that it's in memory and it's available. Interesting? Mallory?
And that happens with every function. So that first pass finds all of the functions that have been defined. Place them in
Yes.
property access to all of them.
But only functions that were declared using the function declaration style. It will not do this with functions that were saved into a variable through the function expression style. So a lot of the times when you're working with the DOM, you're going to be defining a bunch of functions of things you want them to do with your DOM. Like maybe you're going to be making a fetch to an API, getting back a bunch of images, trying to put those images on the DOM and doing all this stuff. And it could make sense to organize your code where you're invoking functions maybe at the top of your code, but in the second half of your code, you're defining all of your functions, right? If we want it to work, we want to use function declaration. Or else things could possibly break. Good, bad? Any questions? Okay. Shall we talk about arrow functions now? Okay. So let's talk about how we convert a regular ES5 function into an arrow function. So how would I take this sum function here and make it into an arrow function? Actually, let me do this further down. How would I convert one of these functions, which are doing the same thing, into an arrow function? Jerry?
You can just write parentheses and rocket ship.
Parentheses?
And rocket ship.
And what?
The arrow.
The arrow?
Yeah.
And then?
And then the curly braces to, and then like that's considered an anonymous function, right?
Mm-hmm. What if we want to name it?
And maybe you can put parentheses and later
Mm-hmm.
play with it inside of the curly brackets to do whatever you have assigned to.
Okay. Matt, you had your hand
Just
raised.
to make a guess, I think you could put the name before the parentheses.
Okay, so like sum, Ernie?
So we do it like the expressive way where we declare a constant sum and equals.
Yes. Then equal sign. So the formula for converting a regular old ES5 function into an arrow function is you don't have the word function in the beginning. You just declare a variable. So there's actually not really a way to do this as a function declaration. With arrow functions, we do end up using function expressions for arrow functions. So you set your variable to whatever you want to name the function, have an equal sign, and then you're going to have parentheses that have your arguments in it. So if there's no arguments, you're just going to have empty parentheses, which could look a little bit funny. If you have arguments, you can put them inside of the parentheses. If you only have one argument, and only if you have one argument, you can get rid of parentheses entirely. So this is how we convert something into an arrow function. Then you have the arrow. Then you have your curly braces, and you can have your return.
Do we need to have a return inside the arrow?
We don't. We'll get into implicit return. So let's test it out. I'm a big believer in testing out every single line of code you ever write.
How do you
What
get
happened?
it to move down like that?
For me, it's Control Command down or up. All right. Shall we practice another one?
See.
Okay. Let's write a function called hello that returns hello world. How would I do that in arrow function syntax? It doesn't take any arguments. Sylvia?
So that would be const
Mm-hmm.
and equals empty brackets
Mm-hmm.
and arrow sign and brackets, curly brackets, and then return hello.
Exactly. Yeah, so again, the old way, function. The new way, get rid of the function in front, and then put an arrow after the name, and that's it. That's how you convert from the old ES5 way to the new arrow syntax. Are we okay on this part?
Wait, so there can be no equal sign? Is it?
Did I forget the equal sign?
Yeah.
There has to be an equal sign. All right, cool.
Sorry, could you just do that one more time?
Yeah. So you take a regular old function written in ES5, you get rid of the function keyword, you keep the name of the function as a variable, and then you just put an equal sign after it and put an arrow after the arguments. And that's how you convert from the old way to the new way. So how can we make this a one-line function? Brendan?
For the hello world, you just put const hello equals empty parentheses, and then just put hello world in brackets on the same line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there is another cool thing with ES6 arrow functions that you can't do in ES5, and that's having an implicit return, like in Ruby. And we can actually make functions happen in one line with the implicit return. If you have a function that's more than one line, it doesn't make sense to do this, and it just won't work. So make sure you really do only have a one-line function for it to work. But if we wanted this to be a one-line function with an implicit return, we can get rid of the return keyword, and we can get rid of the curly braces. And that is a fancy ES6 function that's in one line. So let's actually test it out. How would we convert this sum function into a one-line function? Anyone want to give it a shot? Sylvia?
Const sum equals num1, num2 arrow,
Mm-hmm.
then just num1 plus num2.
Mm-hmm. And that's it. So maybe you might have seen Graham using .then with just like an arrow function that was like response.json. That's where this comes from. So now you kind of know how to go back and forth between the old way of writing a function versus the new way. And let's make sure that works. All right, cool. How are we feeling about functions? How are we feeling about arrow functions? Thumbs up, down? Okay, good. So now let's talk about iterators in JavaScript. So in Ruby, we were all very adamant for you to know your map, your find, your select, your each, right? So like in Ruby, if you had an array of like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you wanted to, for example, select all the variables that are greater than 2, or all the numbers greater than 2, you put your variable name, right? Something like that, right? So let's talk about how we can translate our Ruby knowledge into being able to do this in JavaScript, because you're going to be using this on a daily basis, especially in Mod 4. So if I wanted to write this exact functionality in JavaScript, how would I do that? And let me actually just declare an array variable. Yumi?
Use dot filter.
Yes, that is the first step.
So do array dot filter and
Mhm. What does dot filter take as an argument? This part is very important. Dot filter is an array method which operates on an array and it takes an argument. Brendan.
The callback function, it takes the callback function, and that thing takes, before that it takes, I think,
Yeah, so it takes a function as its argument, a callback function. And what it's going to do is it's going to iterate through every variable one by one in the array and call that function on each one of those numbers. So let's give it a function. Anyone want to try giving it a function? And we've covered about 4 different ways now of how to write that function. So I'll let you choose. Jamil, you want to give it a go? Function, there we go. Okay,
parentheses.
cool. Does it need an argument? Array? So we're using array here.
Index or I.
What is I?
So each individual thing.
Each individual thing in the array? So not index, but each thing in the array, right? Thing. Maybe element. And then what? Curly.
What am I filtering?
What do you want to filter for? How about numbers greater than 2? So like this Ruby thing, but just in JavaScript.
So like return element greater than 2.
Will this work? It will. Yeah, you got it. This will work. So maybe let's save our result and console log it. What?
Not you, Jane.
J.
What do you think we'll see? Let's test it out. Yeah, so we got an array of 3 elements, 3, 4, 5. So how does filter work? Anyone want to give a shot explaining how dot filter works in JavaScript? Ernie.
So when each number is called to be checked to be put into the callback function, if that value returns true, it is put into the array. If it returns false, it is kicked out, evicted.
Yeah, so if that function, the value of that function returns true. Yeah. And there's nothing special about passing it in this way. This is just an anonymous way of passing it in. If we wanted to, we could declare our function out here. So we can have function check value or something like that, right? All we need is a function that takes in one argument. That argument is going to be the thing in our array that we're currently iterating over. And then you just return something that's truthy or falsy. So whatever things you want to keep in your array, you need to return a line of code that's going to be truthy for that thing, right? So we have a function here that takes in one argument, and it does exactly that. So instead of defining it here, if we want, we could just pass check value, and it would work. Let's test it out. Yeah, it still works.
You don't need the parentheses for check value because it's a callback.
Yeah, so it's a callback function. So the reason we don't need the parentheses is because .filter takes in a callback function. It wants to take in an uninvoked function, and it's going to do the work and figure out how to invoke that function on every single element that's in this array. So this is the important concept about callback functions. We don't invoke them. All right. How would we write this as an arrow function? Jerry?
Are we gonna do it outside or inside?
Let's do it inside, because that's going to be mostly how you're going to use stuff like this.
So we can set a const variable and do check value.
So if we're doing it inside, do we need to set a const?
No.
We just want to, how do we convert this into an arrow function?
So we replace the function with parentheses, or we can just leave the element.
We have that.
Arrow function in front of it.
Put an arrow in front of it.
In front of the element.
So here.
No, in front of parentheses element.
Where?
So on line 57, after element parentheses.
Got it.
Put an arrow. And then we could even take out the return.
We could take out the return like this.
So
Will this work? Who thinks it'll work? Matt doesn't think it'll work. Shall we test it out, or? So this is JavaScript. You do need your return. What's the rule for when do you not need your return and have it still work? Matt.
So if it's on one line, it'll have implicit return.
So just like this?
Then you can get rid of the brackets.
Do I need to get rid of the?
I don't know if you do or not.
You do. You do need to get rid of it. Because once you have these curly brackets, it's gonna view it as a block of code.
Okay.
So you do need to get rid of them. We can also get rid of these. If it's only one argument, you don't need parentheses around that argument. So now it works. So get used to this syntax because you're gonna be seeing it a lot. And it's gonna help you write more like concise code, and it's gonna look better if you use this method. Shall we practice with map? Let's do a map and then we can move on to something else. All right, so map. So let's say we have another array. This time, what do we want to do to this? What do we want to map this to be? Let's map all of these elements to return a new array. And let's do something to each element. Multiply? All right, let's multiply. Multiply by 2. Let's multiply by 2. So how do we write a map on this array that's going to return a new array of all of these numbers, but multiplied by 2? Arnie?
Array.map, parentheses, num, rocket, num times 2.
Num? Bracket?
No, rocket, sorry, arrow.
Rocket?
Num times 2.
Haha. All right.
Did I fall into a trap?
Huh?
Did I fall into a trap? I don't like that.
No, you didn't.
Oh,
This is perfectly valid. I'm just very impressed. So there we go. Can we chain these things if we wanted to? Like, what if we wanted to first filter this array and then multiply each thing that we filtered by 2? How do we do that? You me?
Do you want the array 2 or do you
Let's just work with the first array.
first one? So you can do array filter and then just copy paste that one.
Mhm.
And then just add on that, and then
Yeah, so that's also perfectly valid code in JavaScript. So we test it out. It works. So make sure you get comfortable using arrow functions. You're comfortable using map, filter, find, for each. Kind of does the same thing. The kind of stuff you were doing in Ruby. Just remember that it works a little bit differently. With both filter, map, find, it takes a callback function that takes in one argument. That argument represents each thing in the array, and your filter or your map will call that callback function on every single element in the array. Okay. Any questions up to this point? All right, let's see what we've covered so far. Hoisting, all of this. Let's talk about let const var and scope. When do we use let const and var? You mean?
So originally you only had var,
Mm-hmm.
like taking the variables and defining a variable, but now after the ESS you have introduced the let and constant. Now or you can still use var, but no one really recommends using var.
That's
because
true.
You just replace that with let and constant. So I think let is like compared to constant. Constant is just like constant. So like you can't replace anything. You just like once you define it, that's it. And then let is like a counter. So like let I equals 0, and then you if you want to like add 1 to it every time you want to like counter like the loop, and you can use let. But other than that, just use constant.
Okay, good. So if you're going to be redefining your variable, use const. If you're not ever going to be reassigning it, or if you're not going to be reassigning it, use const. If you're going to be reassigning it, use let. Let's not use var. So the thing about var, I used to use var. I used to be a huge fan of var. But I learned that actually var throws silent errors. And we're going to go into some of the intricate differences between let, const, and var. But let and const will throw loud errors, and var will throw silent errors. So what I mean is, you could use var. You can declare a variable. Let's declare variable cheese. It's undefined. Let's console log cheese. What do you think we're going to see in our console? We're going to see undefined, but we're not getting an error. So in your code, if you're using var and you don't realize that something is undefined, it's not going to throw an error for you if you're using var and something is undefined. You're just going to have to figure it out later, the hard way, as Sylvia likes to say, that you messed up and something was undefined. Your code will still work, and it's going to like be a silent error happening underneath the hood. If you use let or const, so if I use let here and I try to console log this, oh, it's still undefined. Maybe that's not the case where it happens. But I've seen examples where it actually like tells you this thing is not defined. Let me see. maybe with const. Here it tells you. Okay, well, pay attention to using let and const, because usually it will throw red errors if something is broken, but var might not necessarily throw loud errors. There's also a difference when you use block scope. Does anyone know what block scope is? Adam?
The scope inside of a function.
So you mean like if I have a function, hello world, you mean the scope in here?
Yeah.
So this is called function scope, different from block scope. Any other guesses of what block scope might be? Lizelle?
Is it the one that you just sorry,
Yeah, both, really. Because anytime you have curly braces that are not representing a function, but something like an if statement or a for loop, that's called block scope. So if, for example, I have this function, hello world, and say it takes in an array, and say I want to iterate through this array. And say I want to console log each of those elements. Right? So the block scope is what happens between these curly braces. If I had an if statement, like if r.length is an odd number, do one thing, else do another thing. This is also block scope. And so using var, let, and const treat block scope a little bit differently. So let's do this example first. So we have this for loop inside of this function. We don't have to have it inside of the function. If we didn't want to, we could put it on the outside, and it might be easier to demonstrate this example. So say we have this array of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we have this for loop here. And we're iterating through the array. And we're console logging the thing at I. This should work. What happened? Still an old syntax error somewhere. I'm gonna get rid of. Okay, I'm just gonna get rid of that. Probably that. Now what happened? Okay. Get rid of all that trash.
You don't want it to be.
Alright. So all of these things are console logging, right? We are inside of a block here, and we've declared I using let, right? If I console log what I is outside of this block, what do you think I would see? Undefined. Any other guesses? Just undefined? Or 6. Why 6? Those are two very valid guesses. I just want to understand why we think it's either undefined or 6.
So after the for loop, so it runs from 0 to 5, because
Mhm.
there are 6 elements.
Mhm.
And then after you exit out the for loop, then it exits the for loop, and then the I stops counting, then the last number is 6.
Exactly. So I ends up being 6 after this for loop runs. So we might see 6. We might see undefined. Ernie?
I think because you're using let, because we're talking about block scope, so the I is going to be limited to what's in the parentheses. So outside I is just, I think it's going to throw an error issue that hasn't been declared, as you said. Anyway, I don't think it's 6.
All right, so let's test it out. So you're right. I is not defined. And this is the part where it gives you the loud error because you're using let. So with let and with const, if you have a block, like a for loop or even an if statement, things aren't going to really work outside of that block for things that are defined inside of that block. But if you use var, it's different. So that's kind of the difference between var, let, and const as well. What do you think will happen if we use var? Yeah, so we see 6. So I is 6. So that's kind of another reason it's better to use let and const, because most of the time, especially with for loops, you do want to just contain the things in your for loop. You don't want them to leak out and go outside of your code and cause other issues. Are we good on the difference? Okay. That's about all I have for let, const, and var. Let's talk about scope in JavaScript. How is scope different in JavaScript from Ruby? Brendan?
You can see variables that are from the parent into functions that have aggregated children. In Ruby, you could access variables that weren't inside of, like, specifically declared for the function.
Yeah, that's definitely one difference. Definitely something that annoyed me about Ruby.
Yeah.
So if you have a variable, like let variable equals, and then you have a function, you can actually use this variable and have access to it, right? I'm sorry for the bad variable names. So let's test this out. Variable hello is hello. So we have our function scope. We have our global scope, because this right here is not contained in any of the functions. So our function can look up and see its global scope. There's this idea of a scope chain in JavaScript. Adam,
So
question?
if let is declared outside of any scope, then it's basically the same as var.
What do you mean by that?
Like it's globally scoped.
Here?
Yeah.
This is globally scoped because it's not hidden inside of any function.
Yeah. So it's basically the same as var.
Yeah, if we use var, the same thing would happen.
Okay.
Brendan?
So if you had this let variable hello inside of another function, and then this function inside that function, it would be the lexical scope? Or-
Yes, so
Yeah.
we're gonna get to that. So yeah, the next question is, and let's make these variables a little bit more interesting. Does anyone like fruits? What kind of fruits? Pomegranate. It's too long. A short and sweet one. How about a plum? Okay, so we have a plum. Let's console log our plum. Let's call this fruit scope. So we see our plum, right? We're inside of this function. We have a local functional scope here, but we're looking up to a higher global scope, right? What happens if we declare a plum in here and it's actually an orange? What would we see in our console log? Brandon?
Sorry.
We would see orange. Any votes for plum? You all are smart. Why will we see orange? Emmanuel?
Because it's going to go with the scope chain, so it's first going to read plum equals the string orange, and then take it from there. I'm not sure what would make it read above that scope, though. I think plum.
The way to read above that is to name this variable something different. But that would be pretty much the only way. So yeah, plum is orange. So what functions do is they look inside of their most local scope first before looking up to higher scopes. And right now we've only seen an example of one function looking up into global scope. But actually in JavaScript, you can have functions within functions, within functions, within functions, like Russian nesting dolls. So if we wanted to, we could have a function in here. We can even make this return a function if we wanted to, because it's JavaScript, and you can do stuff like that. So if we have this return a function, and we have another plum here, that's actually an apple, right? And we try to console log plum in here. What should we see?
Oh, you have two strings.
What happened? Oh yeah, I do. Yeah, so I would see an apple here. So if we were to invoke this, which when you have a function returning a function, it's a little bit different. So here, yeah, because what does fruit scope return?
Scope returns the second function.
Yeah, so it returns a second function, but we can use this second function, so we could technically do this if we wanted to, right? So now our plum is apple. And we can have more functions inside of functions, right? So if you're inside of this one and you're trying to see your plum, it's going to be pineapple in this case. There we go. Luca.
So if you did add parentheses, you would return apple in this case?
If I didn't add the parentheses here, and I only had two parentheses, what would happen? You tell me.
I was thinking apple, but
So, what is fruit scope? Fruit scope is a function, this function. What is fruit scope invoked return?
that returns orange.
It returns a function.
Oh,
What does that function return?
another function.
Yeah, so it returns another function. So we're just getting the other function, and we are console logging apple, because before we return that function, we console log apple here, so you're right. But don't worry about functions within functions too much right now. The idea is the scope chain. So if you're inside of like a nested function, you're first going to look in your own closest scope to figure out what a variable should be. If you cannot find a variable called plum inside of your own closest scope, then it's going to look up the scope chain to an enclosing scope. So from this one, it's going to look up the scope in this one, and it's going to see apple. So here we get apple. So in order to resolve what a variable should be, you look in your closest scope, then the level higher, then the level higher, then the level higher, then the global scope. And if you still don't find that variable, then you return undefined. So that's kind of how scoping works in JavaScript. Any questions about that? Are you all good? Is this helpful? I know it's a little more like complex stuff about JavaScript that you might not necessarily run into, but it's important for you to like know these things, because when you're working with code and things are breaking, then you might have a better understanding of why things are breaking. Adam K?
Why would you want to nest three functions?
It's pretty rare. I mean, it has to do with things like closures, which we're not really gonna get into today. But there's a lot of really, really weird things that you can do in JavaScript. Functions are like first-class citizens in JavaScript. You can pass functions to other functions. You can have a function that calls other functions. You can have a function that returns a function and calls that function only every other time. You can do a lot of really weird things, but you don't necessarily need to. I'm sorry if that doesn't answer your question well.
No, I get it. It's a closure related.
Any other questions? So I think I have a staff meeting that I need to attend. Let's go over falsy values because those are also important. So in Ruby, what were the falsy values? 0 was not false in Ruby.
False.
Was Ruby?
Nil.
Yes, so if we go into IRB, 0 is truthy, right? Nil is falsy. Anything else falsy in Ruby?
False.
And false. Yeah, so Ruby's pretty simple in what kind of values are falsy. JavaScript, not so much. So there are actually 6 falsy values in JavaScript. And it would be important for you to keep them in mind so that if you ever run like an if check for something, you don't expect something to return true when it should actually be returning false in JavaScript. So what are the falsy values in JavaScript? Yumi?
0, empty string, empty.
Okay, so I heard 0. Actually, we're still in Ruby. If we go into Node, we can do the same thing. So now we're in JavaScript land. 0 is false in JavaScript. So let's put that down. Falsy values. 0. Yeah, so bang is the opposite of something, right? So the opposite of true is false. And the opposite of that is true again. So that's how you can kind of check if something is a truthy or a falsy value. Alright, so I heard 0. Let's get the obvious ones out, like false is obviously false. Null, that one sounds pretty false. Null. Undefined. Alright, so let's put that. Not a number. Good one. False. And what data type?
That's a number.
Yeah. Ah! Yeah, so that's a number. What else? What else is false in JavaScript? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's one more.
Empty strings.
An empty string is false in JavaScript, which is definitely not the case in Ruby. Is an empty array false? An empty array is not falsy in JavaScript. An empty array is still a truthy value in JavaScript. If you want to ever check if an empty array has 0 elements in it, how can you do that? Yeah, you can just do that empty array.length. That will be a falsy value. Any other questions about falsy values? What? Did you have a question, Pete?
No.
Oh, I thought you were raising your hand. Did you have a question, Sylvia?
I'm trying to remember something. I think that Graham mentioned that. I mean, or like it shows false, like document dot clear or document dot something.
Between the what?
I will just.
Hi, Liza. Is there a staff meeting? Where is it? Okay. I'll come up there. Okay. Shall we go over point by reference and point by value. Because this is kind of a difficult concept in JavaScript, and we can go over it quickly. And I've made this mistake so many times before. So say we have a variable. So let's let number equal 5. Say we have another number. C? Okay, I might have to slack you later. Actually, no. Let's do. So if I console log number, what am I gonna get? If I reassign number, what should I reassign it to? This might not be the best example. So number 2 is 6. What if I do number 3 is equal to number? What is number 3 going to be? Number 3 is 5. And what is number 1? The first number that we declared. That's still 5. Yes. Are they equal to each other, these two numbers? The variables are equal. Yeah, these values are basically copied over and equal to each other. If I actually change number to be equal to something else, and I still console log number 3, all of this just works as we expect it to behave. But it works a little bit differently with arrays and objects, where you can't copy things over so easily. So, for example, let's say we have an array of students. Who wants to be in my array? Thank you, Ernie. One more. Okay. So say we have this array of students. If I wanted to copy this array, can I just do this? Well, let's see. Let's see. So what is students? It tells you the answer. And what is copy going to be? It's also going to be that. Now let me ask you this. If I want to push a new student into my array, like Mallory, and then I want to see what students is, what am I going to see? So the array now contains Mallory. Would copy contain Mallory?
No.
So that's what you all expect, right? Because that's what would happen with numbers. So, okay, so students, Mallory, as we expect. Copy also freaking has Mallory. And this is confusing AF. So this is the idea of point by reference, because when you're working with like numbers, strings, when you make a copy of something like we did with number, you just expect that thing to now be saved into a new variable, and you can operate on them separately. It's like you forked off into a different direction. You can do things with it. The idea of pass by reference and pass by value has to do with memory in the computer. So this is JavaScript being more efficient. When you create an array, it actually allocates space in your computer to store this array And if you ever make another variable that points to this array, it actually will point to the same place in memory, and it'll only save like the location in memory. It won't save a new copy of this array.
So like every time you run it, line 132 will look at line 131 for what it's going to console
Looking
log.
at the memory address.
Yes, it's going to be looking at the memory address. So when you declare this array, it's going to allocate space in your computer to save this array somewhere. So maybe it's going to have like a location saved behind it. So then when you look at copy and you see copy is actually assigned to students and the memory location for students is in this place in memory, it's actually going to point to the same exact array. I think it's kind of like symbols in Ruby. They kind of point to the same exact place. Sylvia?
I have two questions. One, what will happen if instead of students.push will write a copy.push? Will this be updated in both places? And so the second question,
Let's test it out. So, copy should obviously have the new student. Well, students,
Okay.
because they point to the same place in memory. So whichever object or array you're playing with, everywhere else that you're referencing that same object or array, it's going to happen. You're changing both of them. So if you're trying to like actually make a true copy, this is not the best way to do it.
How would you do it?
I'll get into that. Brendan?
I was gonna say something on how to do it.
So I do also want to bring up, the reason I keep saying array or object is because the same thing happens with object. So if we have an object, like a student object, and we actually have like a JavaScript object. Have you guys worked with JavaScript objects? So say we have Jamil. What food do you like, Jamil? Pizza. What else should I add in my array?
Ferociousness 10.
Okay, cool. So here's the thing, my friends. Here's the thing. So if student obj, say I want to give it a new thing. So what kind of key should I add into student?
Mod.
Smart?
Mod.
Mod? Okay, mod 3. Sure. So if I look at student object, what keys should I see? 4 keys? Yeah, so it's exactly what we expect. If we tried to make a copy, so student copy equal to student obj, what do you think student copy is going to look like? Also 4? Brendan, you're shaking your head? So it's the same exact idea as the arrays. So even though you're trying to make a copy of this object, what you're trying to do is have this be a separate thing here, right? But you're not actually doing that if you're referring to this variable. You're referencing the same place in memory, and this will cause problems. If I do it this way, it's not going to cause any problems because this is going to be treated as a separate object, not referencing anything in memory, right? So student copy. Now it's safe. So how do we get around this problem with arrays and with objects, where I want to make a copy with this array? I want to work on this array, do something to it, and I don't want it to affect the original array that it came from. I want to basically achieve this behavior. Arnie?
I think it's object.assign.
Oh God, yeah, we could do it that way.
Oh.
It's not my favorite way, but yeah, we could do it that way.
Hey, no better way, please teach.
So there's a few different ways to make a true copy. One is for arrays, slice. So slice is a really, really cool JavaScript function, which I highly encourage all of you to go into, and I can give a whole entire lecture about slice because there's so many different types of arguments that you can give to slice that can slice and make a copy of an array for you from one position to another position, or maybe just the last few elements. It can also, if you don't pass any arguments to slice, it will just make a pure copy of that array. So that's one way to do it. So now if I look at copy, so students has Jane, copy does not. So we made an actual copy here, and then when we operate on students, we don't affect our copy like we did before. Another way to do it, does anyone know? Sylvia?
There's another one that's splice, or does it
Splice is mutating. So splice actually mutates. We could do object.assign. I'll get into that one a little bit later. My favorite one, because it works both on objects and arrays, is spread operator. So that's an ES6 feature, which is super, super, super handy. What spread operator does is it spreads out everything in a collection. So a collection is an array or an object. It spreads out all of the things in this array into individual things. And then you just put the brackets back around it to trap it into a new array. And now it's a copy.
So if the student's array updates, then will copy also update?
No.
The student's part? No. So it saves it in this point of time.
Exactly.
It is in this point of time.
Yeah. Mallory.
Could you just say again how spread
Yeah.
operator works?
We'll go into spread operator a little bit. Did I see another hand on this side? Emmanuel?
Will the computer create a new point in memory for copy?
Mm-hmm. You're essentially, because you're putting brackets here, you're essentially creating an array. Spreading students takes all of these values, takes the brackets off, and puts each one of these values into this new array that you've created. So at this point in time, it's a new array with all of these values in it. So then when you're operating on students, you're not affecting copy.
Would it be students?
Yeah, you're right. It should be students. Good catch. Matt?
I just want to make sure I have the two right. Pass by value is like numbers and strings.
Mm-hmm.
The actual value and pass by reference is like the same point in memory.
Exactly. So
Referring to
with pass by value, if you have num, and then you have num2 is equal to num, this is actually a true copy. So if I play with num2, I'm not going to affect num. But that's not what happens with objects and arrays. So here, let's just test. Students has Jane, copy does not. The reason I like spread operator is because you could do a lot of really cool things to it, where you can add extra stuff to it too. So if I have my students in here, I can also do something like, so spread operator students is going to give me all the students, right? I can add other students afterward if I wanted to. So this is a cool thing that the spread operator can do. It'll put my collection of students here, and then I can put values after it if I wanted to. Or I could put values before it as well, if I wanted to. So it's a pretty handy ES6 tool. Mallory?
So it puts it into a new array when we put the brackets like around the spread operator. Is there an example of when we put brackets around it and we could play with those elements, or like pretty standard?
You're putting it into another array. Unfortunately, if you try to look at what students is, it doesn't like it on its own. What ... students is basically an array without brackets. It's just a bunch of stuff, and you need to have brackets around it. Frankie?
So after you put an atom in here, that pushes it into the array.
So it doesn't push it. Right here, I'm actually creating a new array. So this is a brand new array. I'm putting in Jerry. I'm putting in every single one of the students from the first array, and I'm putting in 2 other students. It spreads out.
So students now is just all that.
No, I didn't set this to a variable. It's just an, yeah. Jerry?
Is it only related to like adding students on? Can you remove the spread operator?
Unfortunately not. With removing, you would want to use filter. You would want, like, the cool thing about filter and map, splice would mutate.
But that for removing.
You can, but then you would mutate the original array too. Like if you wanted to have a copy of your array with something removed, it's not a good idea to use splice. Manual?
Can you perform methods on the spread operator?
What do you mean by perform
Or-
methods on it?
Or I mean that, like, so you can perform methods on that array.
You can perform any methods on this array now. It's just a brand new array.
And it wouldn't transform the original array.
No, it doesn't touch the original array. It's a clean new array. When you use filter on an array too, or map or anything else, it also doesn't touch the original array. It leaves the original array. It's called like a pure function. So it makes a new copy for you. So filter, map, those kind of things are really safe to use. And then the spread operator you can also use with objects too, which is really cool. So if we do have this student object, in order to do this, we could just use the spread operator as well. So again, it spreads out the key value pairs and then puts the curly braces to make them into a new object. So now this is a separate thing. And if you wanted to, you could give it new key value pairs afterward. So we can test that out. I don't remember the exact syntax, but let's figure it out. So student obj. We spread this. I don't remember if you need more curly braces, but if I wanted to do this, let's see if it works. Yeah, so basically you can add on any new key value pairs afterward or before it, and it does the same thing.
That is better.
Spread operator is really, really cool. Ernie did mention object.assign earlier. Object.assign does something similar, but with a slightly more annoying syntax. So if you wanted to use object.assign is a method on the object class, and it takes in a few different arguments. Usually the first one, correct me if I'm wrong, Ernie, it's an empty array or an empty object, right?
Right.
So this is going to be where you're copying everything into. You need a fresh slate, so you need a brand new object. Then you put in whatever it is that you're trying to copy over. So it's going to take all the key value pairs of student object and put them into this fresh new object. So that's one way to do it. You can also give it any additional arguments. Like you can pass in other key value pairs or another object that'll merge the key value pairs of the other object into this copy. But be careful, because if you do pass in like a new name here, what this is going to do is it's going to go into student object, copy all these key value pairs into this object, and then it's going to take this name and it's just going to change whatever name was there in the first place. And you can also use object.assign with arrays, but you would just give it an empty array first.
It won't throw an error like name is already taken.
No, because in JavaScript, that's just how you reassign a key value pair. It's perfectly valid to take a key that already exists in an object and set it equal to something else. It's basically merging the objects together.
Just by adding new key value.
Exactly, it merges those objects together. Mallory, question? Okay. So you can do stuff like this. Just be careful with spread operator and object.assign, because while it does make copies for you, if you had a deeply nested object or array, it wouldn't work on the deeply nested stuff. So for instance, Jamil, what kind of animals do you like? Puppies. What else? Stallions. All right, that's enough. So if we were to copy this object in any way, shape, or form, like I like the spread operator, so let's do the spread operator way, actually. Well, I want you guys to see this example, so I'll keep it. If we were to copy this object here, this works, but if we ever wanted to play with this, it's still going to point to the original thing, unless we also spread that, which is also something that you could do. So you can actually spread more. You could do stuff like this in JavaScript. But you don't need to worry about that until React, because then you're actually going to be working with stuff like this more. Are we okay for now? I'm sorry we went so much over time, but these concepts are going to make you really, really good JavaScript developer and like catch errors that are happening and understand why certain things work and certain things don't work. We can do more like DOM related stuff later. We can do a little bit of like fetch practice. I would like to show you guys async await because I think it's super, super useful, but not today. Okay, enough for now. All right, that's all.